Hello and welcome to episode 412 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you? August 6th, Bill, very significant date, not only because it's my wife's birthday, happy birthday, my love, but it's also obviously Hiroshima bombing day.
It is, yeah. So about a few months ago, I was there in Hiroshima. Of course,
Mhm.
filmed that bit of an episode that we posted last year about that. But I do want to say something about for our Marines in the audience, our listeners and viewers, because recently, week or so, as we were recording this, General Al Gray passed away, and I watched his funeral on YouTube. It was very moving. And I got a little tiny bit of history with Al Gray during Desert Storm, that war when I was working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Powell. I was a watch officer in the National Military Command Center under Captain Vern Clark, who later became CNO Vern Clark, who later worked with me in civilian life. But anyway, in the NMCC, my desk, my cubby was right by the door where all the Joint Chiefs would walk in and out. And here I am, little skinny lieutenant commander, Navy lieutenant commander. Yes, in my whites, because in those days we weren't allowed to wear khakis inside the beltway. I'm not making that up, folks. And I sat there and watching my whites, and Al Gray would come by, and I read all the Fleet Marine Force manuals. I was a joint guy. I was into Marine doctrine. I was into maneuver warfare. I was a graduate of Armed Forces Staff College. I could do maneuver warfare planning with the best of them. And General Gray did not fail to notice this. So he would stop by, and I'd have whatever FM pub on my desk as we were planning operations for Desert Storm. And he'd stop there, and he was wearing his camis in the Pentagon. People didn't do that back then, but he would do that.
And if you're the commandant.
He's the commandant, right? He gets to make his own rules. But you know, as I was just saying, people didn't do that back then. Now you see people wearing camis or BDUs or whatever you want to call them all the time. But back then it was a battle uniform. You didn't wear it in office settings. But he would come in his camis, and he'd see the book on my desk. And we would chat. And I would find out how much he personally was involved in the writings of these books. What a great leader. What a great Marine. And he's going to be so missed. Guys like him come by, if we're lucky, once in a generation. And we had a lot of them in World War II. I worry about how many we have today, Seth.
Yeah. Well, ironically enough, and God rest the gentleman's soul, the subject that we're going to talk about today is one of those people. Yeah, he is, or was. God bless him. He certainly was. And before we get on to that, before we get rolling here, I just want to say again, please like and subscribe to our channel before we get into today's show. And do that for us. Do us a favor on YouTube and wherever you digest our conversations. It does help us out. But back to the original point is that, the cat that we're going to talk about today, Bill, is certainly one of those types of people. So when one thinks about the list of the most powerful men in the world during World War II, there are several names that almost instantly come to mind. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Hirohito, Hitler, etc. If you look even deeper, other names, specifically military leaders, pop up that certainly weigh heavier than others. Names like King, Nimitz, MacArthur, Patton, Eisenhower, Zhukov, Mountbatten, Yamamoto, dare I say Montgomery.
I dare.
I dare. All of these men had things in common. Some of them were national leaders, for better or worse, while some were military leaders, for better or worse. Foreign diplomatic relationships were built or destroyed, as the case may be, by some of the names on the aforementioned list. Decisions made by all of these men guided or directly influenced great events of the war, be it they diplomatic treaties, alliances, or the invasion of Poland, the air raid on Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, El Alamein, Stalingrad, whatever. Yet there's one name that is almost always never mentioned, and the man who carried that name was quite possibly, and more than likely, the second most powerful man on the planet during the years 1942 to 45. And if you asked a general World War II enthusiast who that man was, I would bet a lot of money that I do not have that many would give you a different name than the man who actually was the second most powerful man on Earth. That man was no,
not MacArthur.
No, certainly not.
Okay,
Certainly
Nimitz,
not.
King. No, Marshall.
Nope.
Okay,
that man was a United States naval officer. So you were going in the right direction. He was a graduate of Annapolis, the first of the 5-star American admirals of World War II, first of the 5-star officers of World War II, the president of the United States Chief of Staff. I'm sorry, the president of the United States' Chief of Staff, the most senior serviceman in all of the United States military, and the de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Quite the impressive list. That man, of course, was Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy. Bill, this is a guy that, even though this podcast that we started a couple years ago has focused mainly, obviously Pacific, but mainly on naval aspects and amphibious warfare and everything else. It's a guy we've only mentioned a couple times. Yet, this is the dude who was Admiral King's boss, who was ultimately Admiral Nimitz's boss. This is the guy that held sway over everybody. And he truly was one of the most overlooked personalities of the war, and yet one of the most powerful.
Yeah, it's true, Seth. William Leahy, born in 1875. His dad was a Union officer in the American Civil War. Just incredible life. He graduated from the Naval Academy in the years where, when you graduated as what was called a passed midshipman. Then you went to sea for a while, and then you were recalled back to Annapolis to take the ensign's exam. I'm going to call it that. That's not the official name, but you could think of. And you didn't get promoted. You didn't get commissioned as an ensign until you'd completed all of that. So that went away by the time Nimitz and his ilk had graduated from Naval Academy. When you graduated as an ensign, but that was not true for William Leahy. Now, Bill's father wanted him to pursue a law degree from the University of Wisconsin. And from what we know, he seriously considered it. He possessed a stoic, deliberate way of thinking, almost painful attention to detail, which is never a bad thing in the military, and an undying sense of doing what was right. He had this really strong sense of discipline and what was right. He probably would have made a good lawyer, Seth, but that was not to be his calling. Interestingly, it breaks my heart to say this because it's true for Nimitz as well. But we're nothing if we're not truthful on this podcast, Seth. So I'm going to say it. Both he and Nimitz actually wanted to go, I can't get the words out, to West Point. And in both cases, they said, we don't have any opening appointments to West Point, but we do have appointments to Annapolis. And how much richer was the Navy because of it, Seth?
Well, the U.S. government, period, really, honestly, because of that.
Right.
And, in those days, Bill, you know better than I, but in those days, Annapolis was the little brother to West Point because it wasn't as established as the school on the Hudson was. And frankly, the United States Navy in Leahy's early days, or when he was going to the academy, was nothing like it would be. I mean, not even close. It wasn't even what it would be during the Great White Fleet days. So the Naval Academy was, and I'm not taking anything away from it, obviously, God love the Academy. It was a little bit easier to get into. That says nothing against Leahy's ability, however, as we're going to see. But he joins the ranks of 243 fellow naval cadets in May 1893. And as you were saying, Bill, they were not called midshipmen at that point. They were naval cadets. He would graduate 14th in a class of 47. Now, he joined a class of 243 and only 47 graduated. And that's fairly common, though, isn't it, Bill?
In those days, I think I graduated 700 We entered with 1,300-ish. Now it's we graduate pretty much almost above 90% of the people start. But back then it was nothing like that.
Right. His contemporaries, of which was one future Admiral Thomas C. Hart, who was one of his very best friends until his dying day, said that Leahy was, quote, not good and a little lazy in his academic work. He didn't necessarily push very hard to get high marks in the classroom. Yet, Tommy Hart noted, quote, when the chips were down or a sticky problem presented itself, someone would inevitably say, go ask Bill Leahy what to do. And he seemingly always did know what to do, Bill.
Seth, I'm afraid that if you look at my yearbook from the Academy, it describes me as having the highest GPA per hours studied in my class. Now,
that's not a bad thing.
Making that up.
That's not a bad thing.
No, but it sounds like a left-handed way of saying that I was a little lazy too. So I can empathize with the good admiral.
Yeah. He was, I remember when you and I were at the Academy just a couple months ago or whatever. What is this? It would have been good God, time's flying. Yeah. A while back. We walked into the great hall there, and there's this portrait of this dour looking naval officer, and it's a painting, and it is William D. Leahy, and he was known as a dour and reserved person that had a keen sense of judgment and always used good old-fashioned common sense to make proper decisions. These traits earned Bill Leahy the nickname the Judge at the Academy. His keen ability to use his uncommon common sense would endear him to future bosses and nearly everyone who came to know him. That's the one thing when I was doing the research, and I'm sure you can say the same thing for this particular episode. It was hard to find somebody who didn't like this dude and didn't respect him to the nth degree. And I'm talking about even at the Academy until his dying days. This is just one of those rare human beings that just had this character about him, this fantastic character about him that just people gravitated towards. And that's what great leaders do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're jumping ahead, but it was Marshall, an Army general, who suggested FDR that he be brought back on active duty as essentially the chairman. It wasn't, I don't think they were thinking of it that way at the time. But yeah, everybody liked him. You know, once at the Academy, he served in a variety of positions. In order to acquire his ensign rank, he served 2 years of sea duty, as I said, as a passed midshipman before he was commissioned. And as was the practice, his initial service was aboard the battleship USS Oregon, BB3, BB3, where he took part in the Spanish-American War, blockading and bombarding Santiago. And he was not happy about this, by the way. He thought that what we were doing against the Cubans was downright, I think he used the word cruel and unnecessary. So it's interesting to read his comments on this. During the Santiago, he's in command of the battleship's turret number 1. And this and a little bit later, he actually receives a Navy Cross during World War II for an effort to put people ashore in a combat zone. So it was considered combat duty, and he receives a Navy Cross, but he didn't. He never fired in anger during that little bit during World War I. So during that little bit in World War I and this bit in the Spanish-American War, that's it for all of his combat experience. Now, but Halsey was the only other guy, these 5 stars we're going to talk about later, with actual combat experience. That's it. Leahy and Halsey. That's bizarre. And neither of them had significant combat experience. And following the Spanish-American War, Leahy saw service in many foreign ports, not the least of which were on Manila, Shanghai, and ports west, serving on gunboats or cruisers. I point out that he served on USS Buffalo. I served as chief engineer USS Buffalo, but I'm pretty sure they weren't
not the same ship.
Okay, good. Primarily working his way up the ranks. By 1904, he was Lieutenant JG and a married man, having married the love of his life, Louise Tennant Harrington. Seth.
I just want to go back. You said that they didn't have a lot of combat experience. You know me, I'm a Bill Halsey guy. Bill Halsey had a lot of combat experience. If you really think about it, when he was riding on Third Fleet and even then before, he saw a lot of the elephant there for a while. But
Oh,
it's
forgive me. I didn't mean to say that he didn't have it during the war. I
yeah, yeah,
meant
yeah, yeah. No,
it
yeah,
was
before. No,
before
you're
the war.
100% right.
Right. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
100% right. But it's fascinating to think about what you said when you pinged on that and think about that for a minute. Of the five-star admirals, I'm not talking about the Army, of the five-star admirals in World War II, only Leahy and Halsey actually saw any kind of combat at all. King did not. Nimitz did not.
Nimitz did not.
Yeah, and it's
Yep.
it's kind of strange, really, when you think about it. But that wasn't their role. They were administrators. They were leaders of a different sort. Now,
Mhm.
Leahy, if nothing else, was a wise man, literally through his entire life. His outlook shows itself often in his diary. He kept a diary, and of course, all these papers are available. It's difficult. You can read them online, but I'm just going to tell you now, they're voluminous. It's a lot of writing. But he kept this diary or a diary throughout his naval service. As early, and the guy he was a very forward-thinking man in some respects and less so in others, and we'll get to that as we get through. But still, his outlook on things was he was always keen and he was sharp on what he was looking at all the time. As early as 1906, Leahy made notes in his diary regarding a growing concern over Japan and their spreading sphere of influence in the Pacific region. That same year, he wrote, and I quote, "In view of the growing power of Japan in the Orient, where our interests must conflict, it would seem wise to look to the training of our men," unquote. So even Bill, that early, and this is going to be confusing because we're talking about Bill Leahy and I'm talking to Bill Tody, so it's, back and forth. But
Mhm.
even as early as that, the guy had his eyes on the Japanese and was realizing at that point, even then, that they could cause a problem for the United States and her allies in the Pacific region. So, I mean, that's about as early as I ever read anybody, pinging on the Japanese. I don't know about you.
Yeah. I agree. But he even met Admiral Togo in 1907. And you may recall from one of our Nimitz episodes that Nimitz also met Togo. But
Yeah,
I think 1907 time frame ish, Nimitz also marched in Togo's funeral.
we did.
And then later, Nimitz recovered, restored, protected Togo's command ship. So Nimitz and Togo were intertwined a bunch of times. Leahy as well. Nimitz was an ensign the first time we met him. I'm thinking that Leahy was a commander in 1907 when he meets
Believe
Togo.
so.
He felt that the Japanese hospitality and their perceived warmth were, as he put it, plenty to show, but little genuine warmth at all. And there's someone might characterize all Asian nations similarly. They kind of lump them all together. Let me tell you, cultures are very different from one Asian nation to another. And this is a characteristic that's common today. I don't mean to offend any of our Japanese listeners. I know we have plenty, but I've always felt like Japanese are very warm people on the outside, but I'm always wondering what they're really thinking as they appear to be warm to me. But always the perfectionist. Leahy was a taskmaster, but fair. Again, traits that would endear him in the future, serving as gunnery officer for the entire Pacific Squadron as a lieutenant commander in 1910. I was wrong. He was a lieutenant commander, not a commander in 1907 when he met Togo. He jumped at the chance to leave the fleet he loved and moved to D.C. as an assistant director of target practice and engineering. He unwittingly placed himself closer to the man that would define his career as much as Leahy himself would define it. These things in life happen, Seth. There are kind of happy accidents. You can call them what you want to, but unplanned, just juxtapositions of human beings cause unpredictable events to transpire in the future. And this is one of those things.
It is, it's like the stars align kind of a thing, it's like it was meant to be, as you're going to see. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt obviously has always had a love for the United States Navy, much like his cousin Theodore Roosevelt. FDR served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and more than anyone else, save his cousin Teddy, was most responsible for building the United States Navy into an interwar show fleet. And I don't mean show fleet. I don't mean to.
It was a real battle
Yeah,
combat
yeah,
capability.
exactly. Yeah, I don't mean to degrade that in any way, but it was. During his first and second term as president, FDR was the Navy's biggest and most vocal champion and was directly responsible for building the fleet that fought the first 2 years of the Pacific War. And we're going to see why, because he had help from a little gentleman that he meets here just now. His first meetings with then Commander William Leahy occurred when he held the former position of power, which is, of course, to say the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Leahy was recruited by by the man he considered his mentor, Rear Admiral Henry Mayo, to serve as aide for personnel for Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels. In that role, he often met the Assistant Secretary, FDR, and sailed FDR around on the yacht Dolphin. Essentially, and I hate to say it like this, but it's true, essentially he was what we call a step and fetch it man for FDR. Basically, go ahead, Bill.
A gopher.
Yeah, a gopher. Yeah, exactly. A gopher is a better term. And it was basically, hey, I need you to go do this, go do this. And Leahy did it. Initially, he was kind of reluctant to do it, but he did as he was ordered it because he was a good sailor, and that's just what he always did. At this time in his life, FDR was young, obviously. He was mobile. Polio had not stricken his body yet. He was very energetic. He was, I believe, 6 or 7 years younger than Leahy. And the two, once they did meet personally and professionally, they absolutely immediately hit it off. Just like boom. They were complete polar opposites. But their personalities just attracted to one another, and they just instantly became friends, not cronies, but friends. They would sit and talk for hours, much like us, about history
yeah.
and foreign problems, which were harbingers of things to come. And I'm talking, this is way early. This is as FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But right then and there, bam, they hit it off.
Yep. But neither of us were rich blue bloods, though.
No,
Seth.
No, most certainly not.
Yeah. Well, during World War I, Leahy served in a variety of roles, notably sea commands, in which he brought troop convoys across the Atlantic during the height of 1917-1918 U-boat threat. Promoted to captain in 1918, he was sent back to Europe, where he worked in close relations with British naval officers. In 1921, he again returned to Europe, specifically to Turkey, where he acted as a de facto diplomat, an assignment he truly loved. Now, getting this earlier bit in 1917-18 is where he was received the Navy Cross. The Turkey bit is where he learned diplomacy, which would really serve him well throughout his life. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Various commands followed until from 1923 to 1926, he served as the Director of Office of Personnel in the Bureau of Navigation. Now, he's going to serve in BUNAV again later. We're going to come back to that because he's going to run into some dude named King when he's serving in BUNAV the second time. When he was assigned commanding officer of the battleship, then he was assigned commanding officer of the battleship New Mexico. Under his command, New Mexico won the Fleet Gunnery, Engineering, and Battle Efficiency Awards for 3 years straight. Now, that's a big deal. Now, I'm proud to say I received 5 consecutive Battle Efficiency Awards on my ships. It's a big deal. It means you're the best in the squadron. But he's already developing this reputation as a really good gunnery officer. We've talked about Lee, maybe not Lee good, but really good. And he's now a good, pretty good. And now he's a good commanding officer as well. So it should be noted that after 30 years of service, Leahy was given his first command of major ship. Wow. If you're not in command in major command today at the 22-year point or so, you're way behind. See, he's 30 years before he's given major command, and yet he's very successful. So times were different back then, though. People would stay in the Navy a lot longer, particularly through the Depression when there were no jobs and no motivation to get out, right? So the Navy was full and the Army as well. We were full of officers who made careers and went to commands really, really late in their career. So in those days, if an officer of his seniority received command of, say, a destroyer, he more than likely would not have much of a future ahead of him. Leahy, though, of course, getting command of the New Mexico, a battleship, a star is almost always in sight at the end of that kind of career. State of the art for her day, New Mex was only 8 years old when Leahy took command of her. Seth.
Yeah, and it's important that, again, you touched on it, and I want to segue into this a little bit. Is you said major command, and you're 100% right. Battleships and carriers, more so battle wagons in this day for obvious reasons. That was the major command. Everybody wanted to be captain, skipper of a battleship. It didn't matter if it was the oldest scow in the fleet, or in this case, one of the newer ones in New Mexico, but obviously the newer, even better. And to your point, exactly, he's given command of this ship, and she wasn't the newest, but she was one of the newest in the fleet at the time. So it was a prime opportunity for him. And that's another interesting thing that you said that's 100% right, is that in those days, guys would get in the Navy, not just officers, but enlisted men too. You had guys who were 30 years service and they were just a chief, just not even a senior chief. I'm talking yeah.
There weren't senior chiefs back then, but they'd be 30-year third-class petty officers.
Yeah.
There's this photograph called The Old Salt with this old gray-haired dude in his dungarees, and he's got a third-class crow on his sleeve, and he's got a big white beard, and just. That was not uncommon, Seth.
Right. No, 100% right. And I mean, it was a career. It was an actual honest to God career for those guys. And Leahy, as we said, he had a lot of sea commands previous to this, but not a big one, not until he got New Mexico. And he was an administrator. He was seen as more of an administrator and a leader from, like we said, the desk. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we're going to see how this fits into his persona later on. So in 1927, there were 8,944 officers in the United States Navy. Most of these men would never see admiral stars on their blouses, but Leahy obviously does. He received the rank of Rear Admiral in 1927, he received the rank of Rear Admiral, and he was the first of his graduating class from Annapolis to achieve this rank. And and again, Bill, this goes back to what you were saying, in those days, the Navy was a different place. Once he got that star, unless he did something really stupid, he was essentially assured of a job until mandatory age of retirement, which in those days was 64. Like any ambitious officer, however, he had his eyes on a higher prize. He wanted to be Chief of Naval Operations, CNO.
Yeah. So one more thing I'll say, of course, the Rear Admiral was 2 stars. That became an issue for the Army later because you were an 06 yesterday, you were a captain yesterday, and you're a 2-star today. I'm a 1-star. Yesterday I outranked you. Today you outrank me. That becomes an issue later, but it's not yet an issue. The Army hasn't started complaining about that yet. And the other thing I was going to say is that Leahy before he becomes CNO, spoiler alert, he becomes a WWII commander. Now this would cause problems jumping way ahead to 1945 because he's got gunnery expertise. He's the commander of Bureau of Ordnance. He thinks he knows a lot about ordnance. In 1945, when people start talking about the Manhattan Project, Leahy thinks he knows a little more than he actually does. And because of his WWII experience, he says, I'm an ordnance guy, and I know that bomb will never work. That's one of his low points in his prognostications. But his early flag years were at WWII, where his chief, Leahy, fought hard for appropriations with which to build new capital ships. This was what we would call NAV-C today, part of that. Washington Treaty restrictions, we've talked about that before. We're going to talk about that when we cover the USS Indianapolis late this season. Leahy detested them for good reason. They were artificial. They were really bad for the United States. They put severe clamps on the U.S. Navy's ability to build new vessels, in particular when other countries were ignoring them. Much like many treaties today, the countries that actually adhere to the treaties are not the countries you actually have to worry about. Following the stock market crash in 1929 and the financial restrictions were put on the federal budget following the Depression, that crushed the Navy's budget even more. There was a new chief of naval operations installed in the form of then Rear Admiral, later Admiral William D. Pratt, and almost immediately Leahy and Pratt were at odds. In charge of reducing the Navy's cost on government because of the Depression, Leahy's force was forced to cut over 5,000 civilian jobs. That's probably a third of the entire civilian Department of Navy in the earliest days of the Depression, throwing those people out onto the street when there were no jobs and greatly weakening the Navy. The job cuts appalled Leahy, who felt personally responsible and fought C&O Pratt tooth and nail. Strongly desiring to get out of D.C., Leahy took a posting as Commander Destroyers Scouting Force, where one William F. Halsey was one of his commanding officers. Seth, we've heard him before, haven't we?
Just a few times. You know, it's fascinating to me. It never ceases to amaze me that, you know, we just, how many, 8,944 officers in the U.S. Navy in 1927, yet it's still a small Navy at the end of the day, because all these senior dudes that we're going to talk about in World War II, King, Leahy, Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, Jocko, Clark, even, you know, they all served together before the war, and they all knew each other, and for the most part knew each other pretty well, which I think is fascinating, and it's cool at the same time, because, and sometimes in Halsey's case it can actually be a bad thing, but for the most part, you know, it's rather fascinating. So in 1933, Bill Leahy's old sailing friend, as I called him in the notes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, took the office of President of the United States. Almost immediately, FDR installed Leahy as Chief of Bureau of Navigation, which was and still is a highly respected and powerful position within the upper echelons of the U.S. Navy. One Chester Nimitz also became Chief of Bureau of Navigation for a while. In 1935, Leahy was promoted to Vice Admiral and given command of Battleship's Battle Force, where in July of that year, Leahy showed Franklin Roosevelt what the fleet looked like in the largest fleet maneuver the U.S. Navy had carried out outside of the fleet problems of the 1920s and 30s. So, you know, Leahy...
Seth, can I jump in just real
Absolutely.
quick? While Leahy, remember, folks, that Bureau of Navigation was what we call BUPERS today. So they were in charge of the people. And just, I want to remind you of two things. Yes, indeed, Nimitz later was BUNAV, in charge of the people. The reason FDR took so much personal interest in who was BUNAV is because FDR took very personal interest in who was who in Navy leadership, and had his fingers on the pulse of what positions he thought smart guys were going into in senior Navy positions. And those smart guys would be assigned by BUNAV. And that, at this point, was Leahy. So he puts his friend in as BUNAV so he can have some direct control, maybe indirect control, over where everybody was going, including when FDR personally selected Nimitz as BUNAV, and then personally selected Nimitz as the Pacific Fleet commander. You can go back to season 1 to hear all about it. One more point I want to make here. While Leahy is commander of Bureau of Navigation, some dude named King, Commander King, is at BUAIR. And King goes to Leahy, who's in charge of all the people. And remember, King was an aviator, but never got his wings. He went to flight school, but didn't do the work to get his wings. He went, he did get his work to do the work to get his wings. He went to submarine school and was later commander at Groton, but never did the work to get his dolphins. So he wore his wings, but didn't wear his dolphins. But while King was at BUAIR, he worked with Leahy because aviation were second-class citizens for Annapolis graduates. No Annapolis graduate worth his salt wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to be a ship driver because that's what the Navy was all about. But King worked with Leahy to say pilots could be commanding officers of ships, and in fact, carriers ought to be commanded by aviators. One of the reasons I went to the Navy instead of the Air Force is, as taught to me by John Glenn, by the way, but that's another story entirely. So, and in so doing, King and Leahy worked together to up the, what do we want to call the glory? Prestige of pilots in naval aviation, which would have huge implications during the conduct of World War II. I just needed to make that point, Seth.
100% right. You're 100% right. After FDR was elected again, or re-elected, I should say, in a landslide in 1936, Leahy was told that he would be the next Chief of Naval Operations, the CNO. In 1936, Leahy began representing the Navy in cabinet meetings as the Assistant Secretary Charles Edison, who was the Assistant Secretary at that time, was inexperienced, and more importantly, and this is, you can hear this 115 times this episode, FDR trusted Bill Leahy. He knew Leahy from his early days. As we said, he already instantly liked the guy. They both became friends, and he trusted him implicitly. So if Leahy said, "Hey, it's raining outside," without even looking out the window, FDR grabbed an umbrella. It was that kind of thing. I mean, he just implicitly trusted him with everything that he said. In his many meetings with Roosevelt as CNO, Leahy expressed significant dismay over the fact that the United States Navy had been allowed to, and I quote, "Through our pacifist activities, our ships have been allowed to fall below those of other powers." This goes back to what you were saying, Bill. "And with a certain belief that they will be called upon for war service in the not too distant future, I wish I knew that our personnel is in a better state of training than that of any possible enemy," unquote. Leahy was, if nothing else, he was a fanatic for training, and for good reason. He was a fanatic for training, and he could see that, and again, you gotta understand that the times we're talking, 1936 here. This is the heart of the Great Depression, and government spending, as we said just a few minutes ago, on everything was cut way back, and that includes the United States Navy and the United States Army. Yes, we did conduct training, but nowhere near at the rate that the United States naval officers of the day wanted to. Why? Because they didn't have the money to do it. They didn't have the money to put the fuel in the ships to go out there and do the training. They didn't have the money to buy the ammunition, to do to fire the ammunition rounds for training. All kinds of different reasons. But the Great Depression hamstrung everything, literally everything. And as we're going to see here in just a couple minutes, FDR basically just says to hell with it, and he goes and does his own thing, which obviously is a help to the Navy, and we'll get to that. But that's also something good.
Oh, and I was going to say, is it created jobs? I mean, FDR created this thing called the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. And my uncle, who later was in Guadalcanal, that was his first job, was with the CCC. So FDR, yeah, he was building up the Navy, but he explained it to people that what I'm really doing is creating jobs. He had a subterfuge to some extent, because he had to get it past the pacifist, isolationist Republicans. Remember that. The jobs resonated with the Republicans. We have to worry about a huge war in the future did not resonate with what were then the isolationist party and the Republican Party. So he was using both. Go ahead, Seth.
No, you're 100% right. But I wanted to bang on that, that Leahy was going, we need to train. And again, go back and listen to some of our episodes. Go back and listen to all of our naval episodes on Guadalcanal. And you get firsthand experience of how our pre-war training, such as it was completely inadequate for the war that we were going to fight. And Leahy, and this is what we've been trying to say, Leahy could see things coming in the future as if he had a crystal friggin' ball. He could see things coming in the future. He was no fool. He could see that Europe was about to boil over. Japan, oh, by the way, in 1936, they're in China. Yeah, people say 37. No, they've been in China since 1931 in different places. So, I mean, the world is the pot is starting to boil. It isn't a rolling boil yet, but it's getting there. And Leahy can see this, and he's keenly aware that his beloved United States Navy and Army, by the way, is woefully unprepared in terms of training to fight what is going to be quite obviously a different type of war. And that's the key,
Yep.
is that the Great Depression handcuffed all of this kind of stuff, as did political views of the day, I should say, within the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So meetings with FDR and Leahy were common, to say the least. The two men met over 52 times privately, usually over lunch. This is during Leahy's time as CNO. And between the two of them, the meetings went on for hours and hours and hours and hours. As Chief of Naval Operations, Leahy was the proponent to have the new class of battleships that were then being designed and built, which of course is to say the USS North Carolina and her sister Washington, and all following classes of battleships to be armed with 16-inch guns. Why is this important? Because at that time, most modern navies of the world were looking at Great Britain and possibly Germany, even though they weren't building things yet to that degree, and Japan. Most of their battleships were armed with 14-inch guns. I could be wrong here, but I don't think we knew that Nagato and Mutsu were armed with 16-inch guns. At that time, I don't think we realized that yet. But again, I'm going off of memory here. So he was a forward thinker. He wanted to make sure that our capital ships, and again, this is 1936, the carrier really hadn't proven itself. We wanted to make sure we had the strongest punching power that we could. As Chief of Naval Operations, Leahy faced the urgent requirement for preparing the Navy for a large-scale combat action should the nation become enmeshed in a global war, Bill. And he could see this coming. He could see this coming.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Seth, I don't think, just picture this, though. The President of the United States having lunch 52 times, or a meeting 52 times with the CNO. I doubt any president has met one-on-one with any CNO since Reagan. And I think maybe he met one-on-one with the CNO in Reagan to fire him. You know, the old academy teacher when I was at the academy, James Webb, I think Reagan fired. But I mean, this does not happen anymore. But this is the personality of FDR. He said, I'm the commander-in-chief. And by the way, I can't remember when we talked about the fact that he wanted to take the commander-in-chief title away from King.
Yeah.
Because commander-in-chief, King, you know, it was known as commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet. And he didn't like that. And King refused to allow that title to be taken away from him without an order. And FDR wouldn't order him to do it. But I digress. FDR cared so much about his military that he decided it was his responsibility to meet one-on-one with his chiefs of staff and relevant military operational commanders as well, because they're not the same thing. Remember that. And this is incredible. And yes, he liked Leahy. Yes, they were old friends. But you know, do you think that there was no Secretary of Defense then, but there was a Secretary of the Navy? How do you think the Secretary of the Navy felt about this? About the president meeting directly one-on-one, skipping the chain of command. Today, we call those things skip levels, and we encourage leaders for doing that. I used to do it all the time, having skip levels. But this was not done. FDR did it. And as Chief of Naval Operations, Leahy faced the urgent requirement of preparing the Navy for large-scale combat action should the Navy become enmeshed in global war. He pressed relentlessly for increased naval strength to meet the mounting threat. His vigorous support resulted in the Naval Appropriation Act of 1938. And we talked tangentially about that throughout our podcast from season 1, because we kept saying we didn't start building our ships when the war began. We started building them in anticipation of the war. And had we not done that, the war might have turned out very differently. And of course, I can't help but talk about the current situation today and how it relates to that. This legislation upped the authorized tonnage by 20% and fixed the number of naval aircraft at no fewer than 3,000. Funds for the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and the battleship South Dakota and the entire class of battleships were also provided. This is also where we said, forget the Washington Naval Treaty because nobody else is adhering to it. Why should we, Seth?
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, again, 100% right. If you look at the ships that fight the Pacific War, well, the war period in 1942, but especially at Guadalcanal, Midway, Coral Sea, and all that, those ships were built in the 30s. Yeah, of course, there's a couple in there that were built in 41 and 42 that were brand new, of course, obviously, but those ships aren't built overnight. It doesn't take a week to build a aircraft carrier. It doesn't work like that. The money that was appropriated to build these vessels, and the programs were started in 1938, and a few of them were even before that. Modernization of certain capital ships occurred before that. But regardless, exactly to what you said, the vast majority of the ships that were used to fight the early part of the war were built or modernized, as the case may be, in this part of American history. And it was because Bill Leahy was relentless and trying to get money to make this happen, because he could see it coming like a train coming down the track. He could see the problem coming. The serious lag in base development was a particular concern to Admiral Leahy. Under his guidance, the Hepburn Board conducted a detailed study of United States Navy base requirements. Although unable to implement the board's recommendations fully for lack of money, the Chief of Naval Operations, that would be Leahy, obtained a congressional appropriation of $65 million for 15 air bases extending from Kodiak to Palmyra Island in the Pacific, and from San Juan, Puerto Rico to Quonset Point, Rhode Island in the Atlantic. $65 million in 1938, Bill, is not chump change. That is
not at all
pile. And that's a lot of money now, but that is a pile of money in 1938. Huge amount of money.
Yeah. And one of the most unpleasant issues when Leahy was CNO was the Japanese invasion of China. As you said, Seth, this started in the early 30s, but on 12 December 1937, Leahy was informed of the USS Panay incident, in which an American gunboat on the Yangtze River had been sunk by Japanese aircraft. One of my favorite movies, Seth, is the
Sand Pebbles.
Sand Pebbles. Yeah. And if you haven't seen that movie, folks, it kind of touches on incidents like this.
Yeah, very much.
It's fictional, but what a great movie it is. He met with Hull to craft a response to the Panay incident and discussed the matter with Roosevelt on 14th of December. Leahy saw the Panay incident as a test of American resolve. Is American resolve tested today? You bet it is. He wanted to answer it with a show of force, economic sanctions, and a naval blockade of Japan, which is, by the way, an act of war. A naval blockade is an act of war. So that's leaning into it maybe a little too much. But among Roosevelt's advisors, he was the only one willing to countenance such drastic action. Roosevelt agreed with him, but in an election year, he felt he could not afford to antagonize the pacifists and isolationists. The Japanese apology, therefore, was accepted but not appropriate in Leahy's eyes. So referring to Japan's usage of area bombing in China, but appropriate for the Panay as well as Leahy's overall opinion of Japan, he said, "Today, there is an urgent need for a restatement of the international rules of governing the conduct of war. Someday, Japan must be called to account for its abuse of power in this instance." So things are starting to ratchet up, Seth.
Indeed. And again, this goes back to all the way back to 1906, when he saw Japan as being a potential enemy for the United States. And for those who don't know what the Panay incident was, and we should probably cover it because it technically is part of the Pacific War, but it was an American gunboat that was in the Yangtze River that was clearly marked with American flags, great big 48-star flags, literally patted down on the decks of the boat, that was attacked by Japanese naval aircraft, or Japanese aircraft, period, that was not just in one strike, but several strikes, and sunk on purpose. So there is no question that the Japanese knew what the Panay was, that it was an American vessel, and they did not care, and they sunk it anyway.
No.
And as we see, this is, just a harbinger of things to come when it comes to the Japanese and their behavior. But that being said, technically sinking an American, clearly marked American vessel, that too is an act of war. So Leahy could see, again, I sound like a broken record, but he could see the conflict coming here in the very, very near future.
And by the way, Sand Pebbles doesn't really involve the Japanese; it involves China acting against the United States. But point 2 points. Leahy actually was on a monitor that crossed the Pacific. Folks, if you haven't seen this ship, go to the internet and look up with this ship. This ship had like 3 feet of freeboard. Imagine crossing the Pacific in a monitor. This is scary. But the reason we're doing this is for the China conflict. I also covered a little bit of these Chinese gunboats when I talked about McVeigh, because he was stationed. A lot of naval officers were stationed on gunboats in China in the early part of the last century. So, and he was as well. Go ahead, Seth.
So while Leahy was not enthused about the Japanese apology, such as it was over the Panay incident, the one thing that he did like that came out of the incident was it almost forced the United States to expedite the plans for an ambitious shipbuilding program. A further 20% increase in all ship classes was obtained by Leahy, and from this, the Iowa class battleships were born, or at least their designs were at that point. Aside from the battle wagons, 5 more aircraft carriers, as well as 24 Cimarron class fleet oilers were penciled in to be built. Now, Bill, just a few weeks ago, and it actually aired today, was the episode we did on Halsey's Typhoons, which we appropriately called "The Sea is Trying to Kill You," after your oft-quoted statement. But we made the point in there that when we began the war, we only had 6 fleet oilers. And in 1945, 44, 45, we had 30. All this is in thanks to William D. Leahy. Anyone who listens to this show knows how important those fleet oilers would become in 44 and 45. Yes. As a matter of fact, we just talked about it. So upon the completion of Leahy's term as CNO, the admiral was placed on the retired list, and his old friend FDR threw him a surprise party and told him in confidence, and I quote, "Bill, if we have a war, you're going to be right back here helping me run it," unquote. Those words would ring extremely true in the very near future, Bill.
But first, Leahy starts beefing up his diplomacy skills, which are going to come in way handy when having to deal with the Brits and MacArthur and a whole bunch of other adversaries when the war does come. So following his term as CNO, Leahy's first assignment is where he was inserted as the governor of Puerto Rico, which for Leahy was followed by a tenure of American ambassador to Vichy. It was at France or was it Vichy in November of 1940?
Vichy, yeah.
Yeah. FDR said that Leahy was the best man available for Vichy. He can talk to Pétain in a language he would understand. Was that language French? I don't think so. I think what he meant was in a way that Pétain would understand. Leahy did hold some sway with the French, but the French being French, it didn't matter. Leahy was among the loudest voices in asking for receiving U.S. aid for France after the fall of France in 1940. Food, medical supplies, as well as tons of fuel did not buy the American support Leahy thought it would. In the end, Vichy France sided with the Germans, no surprise there. And in July, the French government allowed the Japanese usage of bases and ports in French Indochina. And we just did another episode covering Halsey's actions down there, Seth.
Indeed, last week.
Last week.
Right. So on April 18th, 1942, which if anybody knows what that date means, of course, that is the date of the Doolittle raid, but that has nothing to do with Admiral Leahy, as we will see. Leahy did urgently requested that he be recalled to assist with free French relations. He had had a bellyful of Vichy. Vichy was full of double talk anyway, and he could see this, and he's like, "Get me the heck out of here! I want to go home." In the meantime, unfortunately, Leahy's wife Louise underwent surgery and then suffered an embolism and died on April 21st. He was absolutely devastated. This was the love of his life. He came back home to the United States to bury his beloved wife on June 3rd, 1942. Leahy later wrote of his wife's passing, quote, "It left me not only crushed with sorrow, but permanently less than half efficient for any work the future may have in store for me, and completely uninterested in the remaining future," unquote. However, at that time, those were his feelings, but as we will see, that's not necessarily the case, because once Bill Leahy gets put into the position that he eventually resides in for the remainder of the war, he pours his soul into it. After he buries his wife, he was called to meet with FDR. In that meeting, the first between the two since Leahy had been in Europe, FDR told the admiral that he was recalling him to duty. Now, again, remember, this is June 1942. And recalling the retired admiral, FDR told him that he was making Leahy his senior military advisor. Now, again, Bill, we do this whenever we have the opportunity. We bust myths whenever we can. And a popular myth has been around, for those who know anything about Leahy, that FDR just wanted to give his old buddy a job. He knew that Leahy was lovesick. He knew that his heart was broken, and he wanted to lift his spirits and say, "You know what? I'm going to give you this cush job. You don't actually have to do anything. I'm just going to put you in this position, and it'll give you something to do and occupy your mind." However, that could not be farther from the truth. The time is June 1942. And aside from what had happened, oh, by the way, the week before at Midway, things were still going pretty bad for the United States in the Pacific theater. It was not going well at all. It hadn't turned any tide, as by FDR's measure. He needed a trusted advisor, the president did, and he trusted no one more than Bill Leahy. And again, this goes back to the fact that this wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, Bill. FDR really thought about this. Like, he really poured himself into this whole idea of this new position that was going to be created, didn't he?
He did, yes. So the U.S. had, again, against popular myth, hesitatingly and haltingly geared up for the war, even before Pearl Harbor, right? So we talked about the build-up of ships and supplies and things like that. You know, Leahy was still in his Vichy job when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and his wife dies. He comes back to the United States, and his, that meeting with FDR, I'm sure it went, just so sorry about, your wife, but I really need you. I really need you. And by July, the war was churning all across the globe, and frankly, it was too much for any one man, including FDR, as much bandwidth as FDR had. Too much for any one man to handle. He needed somebody to handle communications and operations and things like that, so that he could keep his mind above all of that. And he was not going to relinquish any power, but he needed a gatekeeper and an advisor, someone who knew the military and how things worked inside the military better than he did. He knew a lot, but he didn't presume he knew more than he did. Now, we say that he was not going to relinquish any power. I'm going to add the word yet, because that jump ahead a couple of years and things change. But right now, at a meeting on July 6, 1942, FDR outlined the position for Leahy. He said Leahy would have almost daily contact with the three current chiefs of staff. As you know, Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces. It was already called Army Air Forces by now. King, who is the chief of naval operation, and Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet, which FDR hated that title, and Marshall, who is chief of staff of the United States Army, Marshall from Leesburg, Virginia, where the house lived for 10 years, 3 miles from his house. And so FDR would outline and summarize reports flowing from them to FDR, and then be the communication conduit from FDR back to the service chiefs, much like the chairman operates today, by the way. How much power Leahy would have remained to be seen initially. But General George Marshall was a direct supporter of Leahy's new role. He had jockeyed FDR for over a month to appoint someone in that position. King, of course, lobbied for the role. No surprise there. By the way,
No.
I recently read King's quote unquote autobiography, and the only thing that's shocking about it is how little King says about Leahy. He really only remarks that Leahy was here for this meeting, there for that meeting. He doesn't really say that Leahy's fingerprints were on any decision. It's amazing how little Leahy actually did, according to King.
Right.
But FDR ignored King. Marshall was the one who initially suggested Leahy for the job. King wouldn't do that. And by the time Leahy was officially appointed on July 18th, his role had expanded significantly, not just what would become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also a fully fleshed out chief of the president's White House staff as well, Seth.
He would be the personal representative of the president. You know, this is one of the roles. And again, the roles, they change and they expand as the war goes on. But he being Leahy, would be the president's personal representative to the JCS. And second, he would be a neutral chairman arbitrating service rivalries, as we know that went on even in the middle of the war quite often, MacArthur, and laser focusing the country's military efforts. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is what the job really was, but without that name. That name did not exist at that point. And Bill, I put in the notes here, we might want to talk about FDR's political motives behind appointing Leahy as well. And it's 100% true, is that, yeah, again, you know, he obviously trusted Leahy. We've made that point abundantly clear, and it only gets clearer as the war goes on. But Marshall also, again, June, July 1942, who is the overriding, and we're not going to bash him hard
It's
here,
not a slam X.
No, but who is the overriding personality, American military personality in American newspapers in 1942, June, July 1942? It's Douglas MacArthur. Exactly. Yeah. And even George Marshall. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So, no, I was going to say there's a lot going on here because, as we said, the Republicans in these days were the isolationist party, and FDR, of course, is a Democrat. And so I'm talking for our international listeners right now who might not get all this nuance. And so a myth developed that FDR was happy that Japan attacked because FDR would have been unable to override the isolationist Republicans and come to Great Britain's aid had we not been attacked first. The reason that myth developed is false, by the way, 100% false. The reason that myth developed is because it was convenient, the timing was convenient. But once FDR was proven correct about the danger of the Axis powers and the United States need to get involved in the war in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, the Republicans needed somebody who would be their face, a popular figure. The Republican position shifted from isolationist to we give fully throated support of the war. Absolutely. And not only are we giving fully throated support of the war, our face, our front man, our whatever figurehead in all of that is none other than General MacArthur. As a political figure in opposition to the President of the United States. Yep. And we talked about this previously in another episode, but there was even a back channel underhanded political campaign to draft MacArthur to run for president while we were involved in the war. Seth, this is unconscionable.
It is. It truly is, but it's 100% correct. And I can already see the comments, the Republicans, and they don't get shut it. Just because this is the actual occurrences of 1942 at this time. Bill is 150% correct. That's exactly how things were shaking out. General George Marshall was keenly aware of General Douglas MacArthur's persona within the American press and populace, that he was seen as this, that he should be the guy running the war, is essentially what the American populace and the press were trying to say. There were a few outliers that disagreed, but for the most part, they all wanted to see MacArthur being the man because he was the guy that was being blasted through the headlines across the United States, even though he was losing. But that's besides the point. George Marshall could see this and he's like, nah, there isn't a snowball's chance in hell that I'm going to have Douglas MacArthur being my boss. Because Marshall and Mac, by the way, if anybody didn't know, they hated one another. They had a respectful working relationship more often than not, with Marshall being the gentleman and MacArthur being the brat. But that's besides the point. George Marshall didn't trust Doug as far as he could throw him, and rightfully
and
so.
Eisenhower and Mac and just about everybody in Mac. Go ahead.
True, but he was 100% right. So that's why George Marshall was lobbying actually to get Leahy put into this position, and FDR also keenly aware of the political pressure that the Republicans and Douglas MacArthur could potentially put on another re-election period for FDR. And again, at the end of the day, the man is a politician, so keep that in mind. He also needed somebody in this position that was not, he didn't have to agree with him all the time, mind you, but was not a political threat. Enter William D. Leahy. A meeting of the combined chiefs of staff was held on July 30th, 1942. This meeting was only 2 days after Leahy's first JCS meeting. In the meeting, King and Marshall felt there was room to negotiate over the proposed plans for Operation Torch. Now, let me stop right here. This is a huge conversation we could have if we were to do something on the ETO, which, by the way, for the 100th time, we're not. But this is part of the conversation here. So we gotta get here. We had to do something. The United States had to do something to support the British war effort and take some pressure off. So we were going to go into North Africa because felt like it might be the easier place to go. And obviously Operation Torch does occur. That being said, King and Marshall, George Marshall too, head of the United States Army, felt that there was room to negotiate over the plans for Operation Torch. Neither of those guys were exceedingly keen on that. Neither felt that the U.S. was ready for such an operation, and both felt that the more goods needed to go to the Pacific. FDR, on the other hand, stuck with Torch and wanted his JCS and combined chiefs, which were, of course, the Brits as well, to know it. Enter Bill Leahy again. Leahy initially was initially viewed as a step and fetch it, as we said, by FDR, but it was made abundantly clear in the meeting that Leahy held serious sway from the president. This is 42. His role and his power is starting to grow. He was the president's voice, and his voice would absolutely be heard. Leahy made FDR's desires known, and then, ever the diplomat and gentleman, heard out the arguments and brought them back to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt did not swerve, and Leahy agreed with the president. Torch was on, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Pause here. So even though Leahy had been installed, Bill, into this position, it was a position without a name, really. And even Admiral King and Marshall, even though Marshall had lobbied for Leahy to get this position, his duties had yet to be fully outlined. So when they're having these meetings about Torch, what becomes Operation Torch, King and Marshall feel that they can, I don't want to say ignore, but they're the ones running this war. So this is what we should do, Bill Leahy. This is what we should do. And, the hell with the political advisors. And it becomes abundantly clear that Leahy, he's here for a reason. And this is the very reason that he's here, is to enforce the president's will right here. And this is the first step that you see where his power is very great, and it continues to grow. Yeah,
that's right. By the way, earlier you said that Leahy is considered step and fetch it by FDR. No, just to correct, step and fetch it for FDR. And you're right. So here's the deal, folks. The civilian control of the uniformed military is an important element of the United States Constitution. And it's still evolved, over centuries since 1776, right? So you've got these chiefs of the militaries that are in uniform. You've got their civilian bosses, the Secretary of War, Secretary of the Navy, and the president, right? And so if you see it that way, it's pretty clear. You've got true civilian control of the military forces, because there's nobody between those chiefs of the services and the president except for civilians. So you inject this guy who's been recalled active duty in uniform in between the secretaries of the services and the president. Now it gets kind of convoluted, right? What have you done? Are you violating the Constitution? Do these secretaries of the services work for the uniformed admiral who's the president's chief of staff? So if you're the chairman or the chief of the service, Marshal Arnold King, you can say, no, I don't work for you, Admiral Leahy. The services are controlled by civilians, not a military dude, right? So this is how by the way, these arguments continued through the 1980s, when it was finally determined via Goldwater-Nichols in 86, that's way late history, I'm sorry for injecting this, that the chairman was merely a communications conduit between the chiefs of staff of the services and the president, through the Secretary of Defense, by the way, that he had no operational authority, and between the chairman and the combatant commanders, right? Because all the communications go through the chairman. So this was evolving through the next 40, 50, 60 years. So this is why it's so convoluted right now. These guys didn't know what Leahy was until Leahy started asserting himself. And guess what? Things started going in the directions that Leahy said they were going to go. Then they had to start taking him seriously, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% right. And that's the important point we want to get out here, is that it became abundantly clear in that first meeting. That's like, oh, he's not just a figurehead. Now this dude, he means business. And I mean, they all knew the Leahy, obviously, but again, goes back to what is your job? Well, this is your job. Oh, I see. So Leahy's relationship with FDR is at the center of this entire episode. And it's at the center of any conversation you have about Bill Leahy, because that's the man who put him in this position, and that's why he held so much sway. Leahy was a staunch conservative in his political views. Like, he was a hardcore conservative. His boss and his friend, Franklin Roosevelt, was most certainly not. He was a fiery liberal. Like any real leader, though, Bill Leahy maintained a fixed policy of never meddling in political affairs or any, quote, domestic partisan politics. And that's, quote, from him, from his diary. In conversations with conservative friends, Leahy never spoke critical of Franklin Roosevelt, but would usually side with his buddies. FDR knew this. He was fully aware of this, and Leahy never denied it. And for that, FDR respected him even more. So Leahy was not a yes man. He's not going to say, oh, yes, sir, boss, whatever you want to do, boss. Yeah, anything you want. Leahy never shied away from expressing his own views to FDR, but always the sailor, followed orders, and never put his foot in his mouth, Bill.
Yeah, so this reminds me of Reagan and Tip O'Neill, right? They political opponents, they would take out the gloves, they would duke it out, but they could still respect each other and be friends. I long for the days when those kinds of relationships occurred. I wish they still did today. But for all the international conferences in World War II, save Casablanca when Leahy was sick, Leahy was there, right there at FDR's side. When at these conferences, Leahy assumed the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ran the meetings. His first swing at this came at the Trident Conference. In that role, Leahy was a master, leveraging every one of those diplomatic genes he had developed during Puerto Rico and with the Vichy in France and all those other assignments. Often his moderate temperament ruled the day. His main job in this role was to build consensus for the decisions that had to be made. Men like Marshal King and their British contemporaries often spoke in grandiose terms, holding court, making great speeches, far too long, with windy descriptions that often teetered on eye-glazing monotony. Leahy would almost always stop the presenter when he knew one of these things were happening. Stop. Stop. I'm just an old sailor. Would you please back up and start from the beginning? Make it simple. Tell me step by step. Step one, what are you recommending? Step two, how do we know when to move from step one to step two? And so on. As the presenter recounted his words, he often changed things because he saw flaws in his own plans that he wouldn't have seen if Leahy hadn't stopped him.
Mm-hmm.
And he would fix his plan right then and there, which was exactly what Leahy had figured out. But rather than poking him in the eye and making it look like I'm smarter than you, he got the guy to come up with it himself. This is a real skill. Yeah. He was sly and cunning, but he was very diplomatic, Seth.
Indeed. He really was. He really was. Ever the statesman, and he was too. Leahy would not shy away from confrontation should the need arise. At Trident, he clashed openly with British chiefs in their reluctance to reopen the overland route through China. An event, Leahy said, quote, would be vital in the war against Japan and the post-war world, unquote. We don't need to get into that, but that's pretty obvious why. Leahy pressed the issue until the Brits relented and promised Leahy that they would indeed undertake an operation later dubbed Anakim in 1943 to not Anakin in 1943 to recapture Burma. Another event in which Leahy flexed his muscle was at the Tehran Conference in 1943. The main topic of the talks were the proposed cross-channel invasion of Normandy, dubbed Overlord, that was slated to take place in the early summer of 1944. The British had been flip-flopping back and forth over the prospects of a cross-channel invasion. This is in the records. So anybody say that it was the Brits who first proposed it? Nope. Churchill had gone so far as to propose further expeditions into the Med in the Middle East, an idea that the American Joint Chiefs of Staff flatly rejected. In one meeting, go ahead.
This is post-Sicily, post-Greece, all that. We're not done. We need to do more in the Med. Is that the way it was working out?
Pretty much. And it was Churchill, Churchill that was the one that was saying, we need to go over here, we need to go into the Middle East, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he was, again, go into the records of these conferences, he was obsessed. Churchill was obsessed with this idea, and he kept banging on it for over a year. And it was infuriating it later became infuriating to the Brits as well, because it was like, that ship has sailed, let it go. But he would not do so. In one meeting at the conference, Leahy's oft sparring partner, Sir Alan Brooke, who was a bit of a jerk, again vacillated on the idea of Operation Overlord, despite the fact that American forces had been building in his own country for the better part of 18 months and failed to firmly stand pat with the idea of Overlord. This is Brooke. Leahy, having had enough of Brooke's spineless attitude, stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and roared, quote, when will you get in line? Under what circumstances are you willing to undertake this operation? And he said it a lot louder than I did, unquote. His outburst, Leahy's outburst, was clearly out of character, but his power and influence was unquestioned at this point. By the end of the discussions, Overlord had been settled. That's not to say that Leahy was the reason that it was settled, but he's most certainly off-the-record conversations that he had with Sir Alan Brooke absolutely had a lot to do with the plans moving forward, Bill.
Yeah. So while all of that's transpiring, there's a whole bunch of other things, of course, that are happening back in the U.S. And by 1944, FDR's trusted aide, Harry Hopkins, very famous guy, well known by historians, had stepped out of the picture. Due to stomach cancer and other issues, Hopkins had removed himself from FDR's inner circle, thereby letting Leahy slide into the position of the president's sole trusted aide and advisor. I mean, I say sole. Obviously, he talked to other people.
Sure.
It used to be Harry Hopkins and Leahy. Now it's really just Leahy. So, that's going down. The other dynamic that's going down here is every time the Americans go to a meeting with the Brits and you have Air Marshal this and admiral of the first Sea Lord that. They all they count themselves as 5-star flag officers because they have 4 stars and 3 stars and 1 star below them. Every time they go to these meetings, the Brits act like they're senior to the Americans. Technically, by rank, they are. Who cares? In my point of view, right? Who cares? Because, you've got their rank and you've got American rank. In my view, at this point, in 1942, 43, 44, American rank, I don't care what you are. This is going to sound very American when I say it, but I don't care what you are. We're running the war in both fleets, in both field of operations at this point. We outrank you, I don't care. But the admirals and generals at the time did care. So it became an issue. I think King was the first guy to say, hey, we ought to have 5 stars just like the Brits do. Of course, it was a King.
No, it was absolutely King. Yeah, 100%.
Okay,
of course it was King.
Makes
of course
no
it was.
sense. I'm not surprised at all. And so a bill had to be enacted, proposed. Obviously, the president had to agree. And in fact, we were given 4 5-star positions within both the Army and the Navy. So the ranks of general within the U.S. military were not what they had been. By the way, at this point of the war, here's an amazing thing. There were only 4 4-star slots in the entire U.S. Navy, commanding the largest fleet the world has ever known and will ever know. Only 4 4-star slots within the United States Navy. Today, the Navy
prior to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. Prior to Pearl Harbor. Today, by the way, parenthetically, the Navy has 8 4-star slots. The Army has 16, I think. Even the Air Force has way more than the Navy does. What's up with that, folks? The Space Force has 4 4-star slots for a service that only has 10,000 people. Get your head around that. And the Navy has 8 4-star slots. But I digress. I'm sorry, Seth. I'm digressing too much today. So why don't you take it from here?
No, it's fine. It's fine. But the point is exactly what you were saying. When the Americans and the Brits met, when the combined chiefs of staff met, the CCS, when they met, technically the Brits outranked the United States flag and general officers who were representatives there because they only wore 4 stars. King, exactly to your point, was the one that said, we got to have 5 stars. And he came up with these asinine names, like Arch Admiral of the Fleet and all these goofy things that that FDR heard and was like, absolutely not. It sounds like some kind of villain from a comic book. And that's exactly what he said. That's what Franklin Roosevelt said. It's like, not a chance. And with just the ranks were established, and it became Fleet Admiral and General of the Army and all this other jazz that we all know today. That being said, the obvious first choice for this new rank was and should have been Bill Leahy. He was the first to receive the new rank. He was, as I said earlier, easily the most senior officer in all of the United States military. He was an obvious choice. His promotion to 5-star Fleet Admiral was dated December 15th, 1944. That was the official date of his promotion. And every other 5-star followed one day after that.
Yeah. And by the way, he counted against the Navy's allotment, which is why Spruance never got a 5th star. But go ahead.
So the newly minted Fleet Admiral William Leahy, like others in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inner circle, were keenly aware, this is 1944, of the president's failing health. By early 44, FDR was in bad shape, and it wasn't going to get much better. Leahy said, and I quote, "The terrific burden of being, in effect, the commander-in-chief of the greatest global war yet recorded in history began to tell on Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, unquote. An examination by his doctor told FDR that he was suffering, among other maladies, congestive heart failure. Leaving D.C. for South Carolina for a rest, Leahy assumed the role of interim president. And I put this in the notes, Bill, and you shot me a text yesterday saying why. And this is exactly why. Honest to God, it was not a title that was given to him by anybody.
Yeah, I
But
checked the Constitution. It's not in there.
it's not a real thing. No, it is not. It's not like interim head coach. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
But everything flowed through William D. Leahy, in and out. He served as the focal point for information to and from the president's office, dealt with messages from London and DC exclusively, took all calls and questions, replied to the mail, and generally kept house while FDR slept pretty much all day and night. In the evenings, he would catch the president up while they fished together. When FDR was well enough to get back to work, Leahy maintained that role, however. In December 1944, Secretary James Forrestal, United States Navy Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, came calling on Leahy on Christmas night to resolve a, quote, serious naval issue. FDR directed Forrestal to do so, putting more power in Leahy's hands. After FDR's re-election to a fourth term, it wasn't FDR who gave a victory speech, but William D. Leahy. The president asked the Fleet Admiral to do so in his stead, Bill.
Yeah, so it would be decades before the 25th Amendment was passed to describe who's in charge when the president is, unable to perform his duties. I want to, just a fun fact here, because when Reagan was shot, retired General L. Haig was Reagan's chief of staff. Remember that? And when Reagan was shot, L. Haig declared, "I'm in charge." That scared a lot of people. He says, wait a minute, the White House chief of staff is declaring himself to be in charge? That can't happen. Why did L. Haig say that? Because L. Haig knew what Leahy was doing when FDR was, down as well. And of course, that resulted in passing the 25th Amendment, so no unelected person would ever be able to say they were in charge of the White House. So, again, boy, I'm full of digressions today, ain't I? When FDR was well enough to get back to work,
though. It's important though, because the point that you just made, if people aren't listening or watching or whatever, they're going to miss it, is that Leahy was not an elected official. He was an appointed official by the president.
Mm-hmm.
So technically, he didn't hold any office that wielded that kind of power. Yet he did hold that kind of power and did wield that power. But as we're going to see, even when Truman comes aboard, Leahy never was in it for himself. But go ahead, Bill. Keep going.
No, that's exactly
what happens
right.
at the Yalta conference, though. The Yalta conference is really the tipping point here, I think.
So at the Yalta conference, FDR asked Leahy to attend the meetings as his closest advisor, saying, "Bill, I wish you to attend all these political meetings in order that we may have someone in whom I have full confidence, who will remember everything that we have done." Now the right hand of FDR in all things, political and military, Leahy was truly the second, some would say the first, most powerful man in the world. Walter Bornemann wrote, "On call, around the clock, friendly, but never a crony, totally loyal, and invariably discreet, Bill Leahy served but one master. He was not a yes man. Just the opposite was true. Leahy was not afraid to argue his personal views with FDR. But once the president made a decision, he could be confident that Leahy would carry it out to the letter no matter what his prior position was." That is true loyalty, Seth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in March of 1945, it was only FDR who went to Warm Springs. Leahy stayed in DC. They had met 2 days before and unfortunately would never meet again. As we all know, Franklin Roosevelt passes away in Warm Springs. Leahy, along with Marshall and King, met the presidential train when it brought Franklin Roosevelt's body home. Ultimately, FDR was his boss, and that's obvious. And FDR, as we've seen, put continuingly larger amounts of responsibility and power within Leahy's hands. And Leahy was aware of this. He's not stupid. He's aware of this. And he is fully aware also that FDR was his benefactor, but to a lesser degree, but almost more important to Leahy, it was his friend. It had become his close personal friend. And again, like you said, they were never cronies, but they were friends. FDR sent very moving personal message to Leahy upon the death of Leahy's wife. And it was a truly a genuine friendship that they both greatly enjoyed over their time together, stemming from their earliest days, and it only got stronger. So when FDR passed away, it was a tremendous hit to Bill Leahy. Harry S. Truman takes the office of president, and he almost instantly phones Bill Leahy. Most everyone, including Leahy himself, expected that he would step down, that Leahy would step down after FDR died, but Truman insisted otherwise. In the phone call, Leahy told Truman that he, quote, always spoke my mind to Roosevelt, and that if I remain on staff for you, I will continue to do so, unquote. Truman replied, that is exactly what I want you to do. A job that Leahy figured would only last a few months lasted 4 more years. In between that, Leahy and his staff prepared the new president for his role. Chief translator of FDR's policies, Truman quickly came to rely on the Fleet Admiral almost as much as his predecessor did, Bill.
Yeah. And then this is a period where the atomic bomb's being developed and finalized, and Leahy declares, as I pointed out earlier, it'll never work. I'm an expert in ordnance, and I know. Turns out not to be true. And, it was good that it was not true. When VJ Day did finally come, though, Leahy was happy and disappointed at the same time. What? Disappointed. The man with whom he had worked for so many years to get to this point, was gone. He was disappointed that FDR didn't live long enough to see this day. With Truman's blessing, Leahy took to the airwaves, believe it or not, wow, that's incredible, to address the American citizenry and the American military. What president would allow his chief of staff to do that these days? Yeah. He said, and I quote, my fellow Americans, we, with our allies, have won what President Roosevelt called on December 8th, 1941, the inevitable victory. The terms we laid down at that time, unconditional surrender, have been met. We must now turn to the binding up of our own and the world's wounds. Today, we have the biggest and most powerful Navy in the world, more powerful than any 2 navies in existence. But we must not depend on this strength and this power alone. America's true strength and secret weapon that really won the war came from our basic virtues as a freedom-loving nation, unquote. Seth, and so 2 remarkable things in that speech. President Truman is the president, but Leahy mentions Roosevelt. And Leahy mentions the Navy. I didn't read the entire speech. I hope he also mentioned the Army, because the Army did a lot to win this war too.
Nope. Nope, he did not. He does not. No, he does not. He sticks to the service. Yeah, but we've preached on him the entire episode, but I put in the notes here. So how do you measure a man of Leahy's stature? And in his case, it's pretty easy, honestly. You would think it would be the opposite, but it's actually quite easy. His ascendance to power was like that of a trusted friend to the president, because he was. Even when FDR was in failing health, and for all intents and purposes, Leahy ran the war and the country, and he did. He never once did anything outside the realm of FDR's wishes. Not once did Leahy ever attempt to usurp power or take a greater role for himself, as others certainly would have. Always working under the name of his commander-in-chief, he worked with no personal agenda saved the successful prosecution of the war. That he did so as a testament to his character and his innate ability to lead while also, and this is the important part, listen. The guy was genuinely unique in American military and political history. I'm not a political historian at all, but I would be very hard pressed to find someone who had that kind of sway, loyalty, power, and just genuine good nature aside from him. And find me one. I'd love to know.
No, yeah. So, Marshall had a lot of power and influence after the war with the Marshall Plan and all of that, but he was filling an official position with with well-defined roles and responsibilities. Yeah, this is unique in American history. I don't think we'll ever see anything like this ever again. And Truman said of Leahy after his death, and remember, Leahy was old. He was older than FDR. And so, he preceded Truman in death. I'll say it that way. And Truman, after his death, said there was never a finer man or an abler public servant. I could always depend on him to tell me the truth, whether I liked it or not, a quality too seldom found in men of his position. And I would add, Seth, it's also true today.
More so true today than it ever was in 1945, I assure you.
Yep.
I assure you. But, this is an episode that Bill, you and I have talked about doing for a while now. And frankly, it was overdue. But this is a guy that, I hope, at the end of every episode we do, I hope that everybody who listens or watches or wherever you get it, that you learn something. And because truth be told, when we're doing these, we learn things as we're going through these too. But Leahy is one of those guys, was one of those guys that is kind of on the outside of World War II leaders. Yet I hope after watching this that you understand just how powerful and influential that man was. And we just did the 40,000-foot view. I mean, there's several books that have been written on Leahy, of which I got 2 or 3 of them over here on my shoulder on the shelf in there. Most of them are about yay thick. And then we're just painting a broad brush of the man's career. I highly encourage you to pick up a couple of biographies of William D. Leahy, of which one of them is entitled "The Second Most Powerful Man in the World." That's outstanding work. The Admirals, written by Walter Borneman, covers Leahy extensively as well. But the dude carried so much influence. And when you're talking about dealing with personalities like Ernie King and Douglas MacArthur, among others, Hap Arnold, who was no prince of a fellow either, by the way, he often gets overlooked, but he was their boss. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was their de facto leader. And it's an important person to note because of the influence that he carried, not only in the Pacific War, but the war and the United States home front as a whole.
Yeah. I'm glad we did this. We should have probably done this 2 years ago. Have we been doing this 2 years? It's 2 years this month, isn't it?
It is.
Or as we're recording. I think we started recording in August of 2022 was our first episode.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, happy podcast birthday, Seth.
There you go. Same to you, Bill.
Well, we should have probably done this 2 seasons ago, 2 years ago.
Right.
And I'm glad we did it. He's such a remarkable man.
Yeah.
He's got kind of the personality and demeanor of Nimitz, and he's able to, and not the demeanor of King. I'll stick to the Navy guys in this statement. And so he's able to do the diplomatic thing and deal with the most acerbic personalities on the planet during this time, and do it with alacrity and panache.
He and George Marshall were a lot alike. They really were. They were separated by several years, but Marshall was another guy who was a hell of a leader. Yeah, a gentleman. Yes, thank you. Yes, yeah, he was a gentleman, true to the core. So he and Leahy were really kind of cut from the same cloth. Leahy was significantly older than, well, not significant, but he was older than George Marshall. But they were a lot alike, and I think that's one reason one reason that George Marshall went to FDR and said, "You need to get this guy in, you need to put this guy in here," because he was no stupid fool. He knew that he could get along with Bill Leahy because he knew him before. But they were very much the same kind of a guy, and that's one reason that the Navy Army relationship during World War II was so good. It was because of Bill Leahy and George Marshall. So there's something to add there too. Well, Bill, is there anything else you want to add to this? I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Like I said, it's something that Bill, like Bill said, it's something that we should have done a long time ago, and I'm glad we did it. I enjoyed really digging into Leahy here. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. Bill, is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Thank you.
All right, cool. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much. Bill, bring us home.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.